Well, good evening, everyone. A warm welcome to all of you. Welcome to the seminar tonight. I think we can all remember when we were younger and we were looking forward to marriage, and we had this fairy tale that everything will be wonderful. But now we realize that marriage is actually hard work, right? Yes, it is rewarding. It is fun. I trust that if we could turn back time, though, we would do it again, right? But still, marriage is challenging. And what makes it even more challenging is that when we have to navigate through changes and transitions, new child, move house, relocate to a different city, changing jobs, retrenchment, or maybe in-laws coming from overseas, sickness, maybe death in extended family, or lockdowns, even lockdowns. All those things can mess up our routine and create tension in our marriage. That's why we're excited to be able to conduct this seminar, to learn from our speakers and to learn from each other as well. We don't think that this seminar will answer all your questions and will address all the challenges, but we do hope, though, that it can shift the direction, the trajectory of your marriage, even so slightly that in the long run, your marriage will actually be in a better place. Okay. So we will start with a short icebreaker. We will then introduce the speakers. And after the main talk, we will invite some panelists to join us to answer your questions. We will then close the seminar with some announcements, and we'll break you guys up later for just short group prayer. All right. Rob and Ruth, great to have you here. Welcome. Let me ask you two questions for people to know a bit about you. Okay. One is, what do you guys do these days? I think some of us know you from back in many years ago, but some of us are wondering, what do you guys do these days? So just share with us that maybe.
Ruth, you want to start?
Yeah. Socialize. I love getting in touch with family. I've got a huge family, bigger family in Wollongong, and keeping in touch with church people if I haven't seen them for a while. We live in a retirement complex, and keeping in touch with people here. Yeah, just like chatting with people overall. Seeing my grandchildren when we can. We go and see them play sport, sometimes 3 or 4 of them on one Saturday. So yeah, all sorts of bits and pieces.
That's good.
I'm just enjoying retirement. It's really good. We've been gone for 8 years.
He hasn't been retired all that time.
I've been working with a church that does outreach to international students at Wollongong Uni, which is about less than 4 k's away from our home, and so I'm still involved in that, involved with the preaching and teaching with different churches in the Illawarra. And the thing that I've really enjoyed doing, probably most of all, is not having to do administration associated with the with being in the church. And one final thing for me is that some of you may or may not have known, but when I was at CrossCulture, for about 5 years, I was teaching church planting in the Philippines. Well, after retirement, I did that for another 3 years. And since 2015, I've also been doing church planting and training of pastors in Nepal. So in fact, I go off again next week. So twice a year, going off to Nepal for 2 weeks at a time and do training of pastors. And that's been absolutely amazing, the stuff that God is doing. So I'm loving retirement.
Wow, it doesn't sound like you're retired, Rob. It sounds like you do more than
not.
Anyway. All right, second one. In terms of the sparks in a marriage, I believe you guys are 8 out of 8, right? But if you were to turn back time, what would you like to do to increase the sparks even more in your marriage?
Do you want me to go first?
Yes.
Yeah. One of the things that I learned when I was working with a multinational was through leadership training. I was told you always first need to seek understanding, and I was reminded of that earlier this week when it was said, when two people are in disagreement, when people are disagreeing, the aim of their ongoing interaction is not, let me say, it isn't to get agreement or compromise or even compliance. Rather, it's to seek to understand. In other words, if we've got a disagreement, why is this here? What is driving your thinking, and so forth? And I think a person who acts with understanding has a better chance of building relationship than a person who doesn't understand why things are happening. And I think that's a pretty important aspect of reigniting the spark in your marriage. Seek to understand first, then to be understood.
That's good.
You're looking at me.
Yes, I'm looking at you.
Yeah. I wish I could have spent more time with you. You were so busy, and I would have loved to have spent more time with you. So I was looking forward to that in retirement. And then you got really, really busy, and sometimes it didn't happen as much, or he was going off to Nepal or wherever. So, but finally, he's sort of been retired a lot more since November, only since November.
Wow.
And so I get to see him a lot more. And we even sit and watch the Sydney Swans play together. And yeah, I mean, I join him. He's the big fan, but I join him and getting to share things with him like that.
It's good. So I guess both of you mentioned quality time, understanding, communication, which is the thing that people answer just on, which is fantastic. So it's good to hear that as well. So thanks for sharing. I hope that you guys, I hope that participants know a bit about Rob and Ruth. So I hand the time to you now, Rob and Ruth. So take it away.
Another thing that I learned through leadership training was the fact that if you want to continue to grow your people, you must always, as a leader, remind the people of the vision. Now, this is in secular industry, but I believe also it's equally true when it comes to our marriage relationship. And so it's my intention to remind you of the vision that God has, the vision that God has for the marriage relationship. And I expect that that will help us to identify how we might reignite the spark of marriage. The session is going to cover why we should reignite our marriage, provide some strategies and examples for reigniting our marriage. And also, as Sandy has said, we'll be looking at your questions and seeking to answer them. And if you do have access to a Bible, a pen and paper for taking notes, you might find that helpful. So let's begin by looking at why should we reignite our marriage? Well, firstly, in God's word, in Genesis 2 and verse 18, we get told it's not good to be alone. And let me say to you that Christians, Jews and Muslims do actually share a common tenet of faith, and that is God established marriage between a man and a woman. And he did that because he said it's not good to be alone. Now, while some people choose not to marry, they nevertheless agree it's not good to be alone because they choose to live together as partners outside of marriage. And so the first reason why we should seek to reignite our marriage is that if you fail to do so, it may lead you to living alone. I want you to remember also, as a second reason, remember your marriage vows. I don't know how many of you recognize that traditional Christian vows involve two promises that are made to each other with God as their witness. And those two promises involve exclusivity and permanence. In traditional Christian vows at a marriage service, you were saying to your partner, I know there are many fish in the sea, but I've now chosen, I have decided, I am intentional in being exclusive in partnership with yourself. And the other thing that's important is the idea of permanence. That is, this is something that we should be doing and maintaining through good, through tough times. Now, I'm not against couples writing their own vows. However, I do insist that if they wish me to officiate, they need to include some reference to these two promises of exclusivity and permanence. Now, some of you might think, oh, that's a bit harsh. Well, I would remind you to remember what Jesus taught in Matthew 19, verses 1 to 11. Now, I'm not going to go through all of it, but the situation was in verse 3, Pharisees came up to Jesus and asked him the question, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? And then he goes into a spiel going back to Genesis, the early part of the Bible. And he said, it was never intended by God for divorce to take place. And so they said to him in verse 7, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce? And he replied, he said, it's only because of the hardness of your heart. And I think that's very telling, folk. If we are not willing to forgive quickly, we can build up a sense of resentment in our interaction with each other. Now, when the Pharisees left, the disciples turned to Jesus and said, if what you've said is true about a man and a wife, it's better not to marry. And then Jesus says in verse 11, not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it is given. So I say to you that a reason, an initiative, a driver to reigniting the spark in your marriage is remember your marriage vows, which most likely did include a vow, permanency, and exclusivity. We need also to remember that God in Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 to 16, tells us that God hates the breaking of the marriage vow because of what it does to that family unit, including the impact it has on godly offspring. And that's why in verse 16 of Malachi 2, God says, I hate divorce. And we need to remember that it's because of the hardness of our heart that God allowed divorce. And it's often the hardness of our heart that drives us to walk away from those vows that we had made to each other. And a third reason that I want to share with you, which should be an encouragement to reignite the spark, is that we find marriage is a metaphor, or it's a picture of Christ's love for the church. Did you know that the quality of your marriage is intended by God to be a public testimony of Christ's relationship with the church? Fulfilling the instructions in Ephesians 5, verses 22 to 33, which we'll have a look at in a moment, will enable believers' marriages to speak a message to the outsiders. My marriage is not just good, it points to an even greater, an even higher good. And so here are three reasons why we should seek to reignite the spark. I had actually other reasons that I could have had, but I felt these were the three that impressed me most that I needed to share with you. So how do we go about reigniting the spark of our marriage? I want to do two things briefly, introduce you to what we call the inclusio concept. It's a bit technical and it's a bit complicated, but I think you'll pick it up pretty quickly. And then I'm going to, using that inclusio concept, expound Ephesians 5, verses 22 to 23. And inclusio is actually a literary device. It's used by Old Testament writers, it's used by New Testament writers, it's been also used by ancient writers who don't write the Old Testament and New Testament. So it's not something new. Another name for inclusio might be bracketing or framing. Personally, I like the term sandwich structure, which I'll show you in a moment. Let's have a look. What happens in an inclusio is that you find a story, which I've shown as inclusio part A and part B, interrupted by a material that is included in the as part of the original story. So the original story is being told, but then there is new material outside of the story introduced into that passage. So can you see how that looks like a sandwich? So the inclusio is the bread on the top and the bread on the bottom, and the material within the inclusio is, if you like, the meat of the sandwich. Now, the purpose of an inclusio, the reason the writers use inclusios or a sandwich structure is that very often the material within the inclusio is able to feed important information into part A of the story or part B of the story, or parts A and B might add to the material that's within the inclusio. Originally, I had arrows going everywhere, and I thought it's simple to just have an up and down. It could go any way at all. And an important part of an important example of an inclusio is actually found in Jairus' story. Remember how Jairus had a daughter, a young daughter, who was unwell, and Jesus took time to go and check out, Jairus went to find Jesus to see if he would come and make and heal his daughter. For example, we read in verse 22 of Mark 5 that one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing Jesus, fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So Jesus goes off with Jairus. But then we have a separate story coming in. In verse 25, we are told there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years. Verse 27, she had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. This story has nothing to do directly with the story of Jairus' daughter. So why has Mark interrupted the story of Jairus' daughter with this one about the woman with the bleeding? Well, I think the answer is to be found in verse 34. Having confessed that she touched his garment, Jesus turns to the woman who had been bleeding for 12 years and says to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." The story then fades back to the second part of the inclusio. While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" And let's stop there. Let's stop there for a moment, because this is where the inclusio, material within the inclusio, becomes so important. The last thing that was said in verse 34 was Jesus' words to the woman. "Your faith has made you well." And so what Mark, the writer, is doing is drawing back on the need for faith in Jesus in order to carry on the story about the healing of Jairus' daughter. And in fact, in verse 36, Jesus overheard what the people were saying to Jairus, and he said, therefore turned to the ruler and said, "Do not fear, only believe." Now, friends, what I'm saying is that this concept of an inclusio is something that regularly happens within Scripture. In fact, in the Gospel of Mark, if I remember correctly, there's about 9 inclusios that are used. And every time you come across an inclusio, I strongly encourage you to go back and say, aha, we've started with this, the story's been interrupted, now we're going to understand that the material within the inclusio so that we can understand how the story wraps up. Now, I want to indicate to you that Paul in Ephesians 5 also uses an inclusio. What you have in this, what you have here is the inclusio, that is the sandwich, is verses 22 to 24. Then we have verse 33 as the bottom part or the second part of the sandwich. And this becomes very important for the reasons that I'll now explain. I want you to note, if you have a Bible, that verses 22 to 24 and verse 33 deal with the responsibilities of wives in the marriage. And that means this is an inclusio. And the importance of an inclusio is that it alerts us as readers to something that's particularly important. It's a theme that we need to understand. And it may even show us how the material within the inclusio relates to the inclusio itself. In other words, what we have here is material contained in verses 25 to 32, which strongly relates to the matter about the wife's responsibilities. So I'm going to start by looking at what I've highlighted in yellow, which starts with, in verse 25, husbands, love your wives. We are looking at the husband's role in marriage, and it's summarized as husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. That's the first part of verse 25. Then the question arises, how did Christ show his love for the church? And what Paul does in his letter to the Ephesians is to spell out three things. The first thing is he gave himself up for her. That's verse 25b. That is, Jesus handed himself over, and that speaks of self-sacrifice. And friends, that's the pattern Jesus has set for husbands in their relationship with their wife. There needs to be a willingness to self-sacrifice. When I retired from CrossCulture, my preference was to continue to live in our Melbourne apartment. But Ruth, my wife, longed to return to our hometown of Wollongong. Awkward. And for various reasons I won't go into, I was reminded of Christ's pattern of the need for the husband to self-sacrifice. So I gave myself over to Ruth's longing, and we did return to Wollongong. And I got to add, it's turned out to be a very, very good decision. It was a great decision. I know of a young Christian man who had reasons for travelling interstate for work for 3 days. But things were difficult at home at that stage. And his wife asked him if he would defer his trip to deal with the home issues. He did. He handed himself over to meet the needs of his wife and the family. And so he rescheduled the interstate trip. Now, friends, we must always remember that the giving over to ourselves as husbands is never to be an excuse for acting contrary to God's word. Secondly, what's the ultimate purpose of self-sacrifice? Well, let's read on in verses 26 to 28. Jesus has given himself over to the church so he might sanctify her, set her apart for her special duties, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. And in the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. I say to you who are husbands, like the church, Our wives are not without spot and blemish. But it's not our job, it's not our role to try to address these spots and blemishes. Rather, when we give of ourselves to the wife's needs, it creates an environment which makes it easier for the word of God to transform her character by cleansing through the washing of the word. Being sovereign, God will decide the priority and method by which various spots and blemishes that exist in our wives ought to be dealt with. It's every man's desire to be the best possible man he can. And our willingness to emulate, to copy, to follow Christ's example creates the environment which enables the wife to be the best woman she can. The spots and the blemishes that we may find in our wives will decrease as the husband maintains that environment in which the wife can be cleansed by the word. And thirdly, we are told Christ's love for the church is shown by the fact that he nourishes and cherishes it. And we as husbands are to do the same for the wife. The word nourish means to care for, to enable healthy growth and development. On the other hand, the word cherish carries the idea of bringing warmth, a sense of well-being. So as husbands, we are called to love our wives in a way that promotes her growth and which provides her a sense of security. Every day, every Friday, my father would come home from work with a bunch of flowers for my mother. There was never a question of whether Dad would come home with flowers. The only question was, what type of flower? Red roses, pink carnations, or maybe some Australian native flowers. My mother never doubted my father's love for her. I wonder if we as husbands asked our wives to rate us between, I was going to say 1 and 10, but maybe I should say between 1 and 8, the degree to which she feels nourished, encouraged to grow and develop, and feels cherished, where she has a sense of well-being, a sense of security. And so what we read in the material between the inclusio, to summarize, says, Christ showed his love for the church by 3 things: a willingness to self-sacrifice, secondly, creating an environment that is conducive to character transformation, and thirdly, by nourishing and cherishing her wife. And friends, husbands are called to exemplify that pattern that was set by Christ. So at the outset of this exposition, I mentioned that the inclusio alerts us as readers to a particularly important theme, and it may show us how the material within the inclusio relates to the inclusio itself. So let me explore how this works with this part of Scripture. The first part of the inclusio, which we read in verses 22 to 24, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Saviour. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Now, the word submit in the Greek means be willing to place or rank yourself under. It means be willing to follow the instruction or the encouragement of your husband. It is to be likened, just as the church chooses to place or rank itself under Christ and therefore obey him, in the same manner, the wives can choose to place or rank themselves under their husbands. Now, let me make it clear. In the Greek language, it's in the passive, which means it is not something that is a command that must be obeyed. It is a willingness of the individual, in this case of the wife, to place herself in that position or not. The closing part of the inclusio is in verse 33. And the word respect in verse 33, the second part of that, is from the Greek word phobia. You might be familiar with, we get the English word phobic. It means to be anxious, to have a reverential fear. Now, the material within the inclusio tells us that the quality, and here is the point, folks, the quality of which the husband performs these three activities of self-sacrifice, seeking the best for his wife, and nourishing and cherishing her will influence the degree to which she will be willing to submit and respect her husband. Did you get that? That's a very important point. The inclusio is saying, husband, here is your role, and how will you fulfill that role will directly impact and affect the degree to which your partner, your wife, is going to be willing to put herself under your leadership and respect that leadership. This is why I believe God will hold husbands accountable for how things go in the relationship. It should be noted that in this passage, I think it's clear that it is the Lord who will determine the reasonableness of any actions taken by a couple. What that means is that the husband should never demand submission of the wife, because verses 22 to 24 is actually a matter between the Lord and her. Paul is writing to wives, speaking on behalf of the Lord. And in the same way, wives should not complain that the husband hasn't loved her the same way that Christ loves the church, because this is a matter between the Lord and the husband. So how do we develop strategies to reignite our marriage? Well, as I said earlier, a popular mantra in leadership courses is first seek to understand. When people disagree, the aim of their ongoing interaction shouldn't be to first get agreement, compromise, or compliance, but it's about getting to understand. Understanding will flow readily when parties enact the principles that were read in Ephesians 5, 22 to 33. The importance of talking with each other for the purpose of seeking understanding is illustrated in the following stories. I told you how pleased my mother was to receive flowers every Friday evening. So guess what? When I got married, I decided to bring home flowers for Ruth. I admit it wasn't every week, but it was regular. One day, Ruth told me that while she appreciated the thought of flowers, she actually thought that the activity was a waste of money. A waste of money? What woman doesn't like flowers? Again, that was awkward. I learned that Ruth's love language is not gifts, but quality time. And we both agree and have shared that the hardest time in our marriage for Ruth was when I gave my time simultaneously to pastoring and Bible college, because it didn't offer her the level of quality time that she needed. A Christian couple I know with 2 infant children was struggling in their marriage without really knowing why. It wasn't until they sat down and talked about their frustrations that they understood and then agreed to have the father spend more time with each of the children. And I'm pleased to say that 4 months later, they both agree that their marriage has been reignited, because the couple took to understand what the cause of the frustrations were and then found a way to resolve that. There was a period early in our family life that was troubling for me. I'd come home from work and I'd object to Ruth's surliness, being aloof, being frosty. And we sat down and talked about the situation, and I understood that the problem on this occasion wasn't my fault, but it was with the children. She explained to me that the boys would come home from school and ignore Ruth's instruction to change out of the school uniform and put on play clothes. They also ignored her directive later on in the afternoon to come in and do the homework. On understanding the root cause of the problem, we then agreed the solution was for me to firmly explain the pecking order in our family and why that was the case, and the consequences of violating that order. The children understood the message, the problem rarely reoccurred, and our marriage was reignited. And I'm going to suggest to you that a correct understanding and practice of Ephesians 5:22-33 provides a useful biblical template for reigniting the marriage. I got to admit, when Sandy asked me to participate in the workshop, I did wonder what I might share with you. And I was coming up with all these ideas. Well, practically we can do this and we can do that and all the rest of it. And then I was reminded of how some Christian men, in fact, these were men from Nepal, who were aged in their 60s, wept when this passage of scripture was first expounded to them. Oh, look, these people believed in Jesus as their savior and believed him to be the Son of God. But as we went through that passage of Ephesians 5, they were convicted that in ignorance, they hadn't loved their wives as taught in this passage. The couple who decided the husband needed to spend more quality time with the children admitted that whilst they were familiar with the teaching of Ephesians 5, because we put them through marriage preparation class, they had let it slip from their practice. And so I decided it was important to put a scriptural basis around how we might reignite the marriage relationship. As I said early in my working life, I learned the importance of regularly reminding people of the organisation's vision. In this workshop, I've reminded you of God's vision for marriage, which should also be the vision of the church. That is, your vision and my vision. And I trust that my sharing has somewhat helped you to identify ways to reignite the spark in your own marriage.
Okay. Thank you so much, Rob. I think you give us a good grounding, good foundations there. So let's take some questions right now. I invite Carolyn and Barry. Yes, welcome to you. And we want to invite Uncle TC and Auntie Mary as well. Feel free to unmute yourselves, Barry, Carolyn, and TC and Mary. Thanks for joining us. We have a few questions that have come in, so maybe we'll start some of the questions right now. Let's start with this one. How did you prioritize your marriage in the early years of parenting? How did you prioritize your marriage in the early years of parenting? Maybe start with Uncle TC, Auntie Mary. You can kickstart that.
For us, during early years of marriage, we always spend a lot of time together after doing all the chores in the house and putting the children to bed, and then we sit down, have a chat and have a cup of coffee together and spend quality time. Yeah, that's what we did. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think helping each other to finish the chores and getting the children to bed definitely helps, because then you feel that that's the end of one day, and you feel like it's such an achievement. And you sit down and you talk, and then that's where you communicate. So quality time is definitely our love language for each other. Yeah.
Okay. What about you, Barry, Carolyn?
Was a long time ago, so
You remember back.
So I asked Tamara and my other children what they remember, because they're better than me than remembering. And I think one of the things was they knew exactly where they stood as far as our relationship and our relationship to them. Like, they knew they were loved. But Tamara said to me one day, I've forgotten this. She said, "Oh, who do you love more, me or Dad?" And I said, "Oh, Dad." And she said, "Oh, she was devastated." And I thought, "Oh, dear, I don't even remember that happening." But that's what we tried to do, and set up boundaries so they knew exactly that our relationship was number one, and we worked as a team. So if they asked, or asked me, "Oh, can we do this or do that?" I'd say, "We'll have to talk to your father and we'll let you know." So they knew that we were together as one with the decisions we made about them, and they knew where they stood. And I think that way our relationship was sort of prioritised. Our relationship with God was number one, and then with each other, and then our love for our children.
I think that's such a great reminder, because it's easy to put our kids first before our spouse.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Caroline. What about you, Rob, Ruth?
Well, the story I told about coming home from work and finding Ruth at times a bit, she can get surly. Yeah, she can be. It's not always joy, but just bear with me as I explain a little bit the story. Once I understood what was going on, I decided to line up the boys, and I will use the word, I was a Nazi. Right, stand up. I want you to stand up straight. Head up. Tummy in. I was actually that, because I thought, whoa, this is something serious, because I don't normally talk that way, not to the kids. And I just said to the kids, I said, look, I want you to understand that your mother and I decided we were going to come together as husband and wife, right? And that's where our priority. So very similar to what Carolyn has just said. And that's what we did. And I said, and you are fruit of our love for each other. And so the priority will be, as Carolyn has shared. And we basically did the same thing. And as I said when I told the story, that the kids understood the pecking order, and those problems didn't arise anymore, because they knew that they would have to respond to Ruth, and if they didn't respond to Ruth, it would affect her interaction with me, and therefore Nazi Rob would come back.
That's fantastic.
Same sort of thing, same thing.
Yeah.
I don't remember how old they were, do you?
I think they're primary school.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're primary school kids.
Yeah, I think the children must really understand fully what, as Rob mentioned in his message, the pecking order. And I think that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, I still remember. I guess I think kids are very clever. They know whom to ask for different kinds of favor. So, I think we remember that if I say something that goes against what Maria has said, wow, that creates tension in our marriage. So I make it a habit to, what did mommy say? What did mommy say?
That's right.
And Maria also said the same thing. What did Daddy say? So that we want to make sure that we are united, because kids are quite capable when it comes to that kind of stuff. That's good. The second question, I want to direct this to Rob particularly, because I think it is quite theological in nature. God hates divorce, but does God encourage divorce in special circumstances, such as the spouse has become an unbeliever, the family doesn't have peace due to constant fighting, or the spouse physically or emotionally abuses every day, even after counseling? I know this can be quite a heavy topic, but let's not dwell too much on it. But just wondering, on top of your head, how would you answer that, bro?
I think there are a number of things there that you've covered. The first thing is, I think Malachi makes it very clear, and it was reinforced by the teaching that Jesus quoted from the Old Testament. I'm very clear that God hates divorce, but he, in his mercy, allows divorce to take place, because if we have hardness of heart, we're actually making it worse. But we need to understand that there is a situation where the damage on the children will be greater by having the couple stay together, right? But just as, I mean, if you think about ourselves in our relationship with God, and I can remember that I was a non-believer until almost my 27th birthday. God had a lot to forgive, right? In my relationship with him. Why would you ever want to come into a relationship with Rob? Is kind of how it would be. But he had the ability to forgive. You and I, in our fallen nature, we're not perfect people. That is, we are not fully transformed into the likeness of Jesus. So we still have spots, we still have blemishes, and it may not be possible for us or our partner to forgive us. In the context of what do you do if the person ceases to be a believer, doesn't go to church, doesn't support the kids going to church and so forth? The Bible, I think, does not give that as a reason for divorce. You know, we could argue about what does it mean about adultery and things like that if someone's been unfaithful. Yes, Matthew makes that very clear that there is a ground for divorce there. But if we had it in ourselves to forgive our partner for that mistake or mistakes, how many times am I to forgive? Peter asked Jesus. You know, but we may not have the ability to do that. Now that's a pretty, I think, biblical explanation or response to that. But it's a bit like it in Matthew 18. Not everybody can take that teaching.
Thanks for that, Rob. Whoever is asking that question, if you're asking for yourself or maybe asking for your friend, I would encourage you to actually speak to one of the pastors, maybe, so that you can maybe have a bit more chat on about that one. So I wonder if there's extra pastoral care that might need to be done in that one. So just inviting you there. I will jump on the next question. What spiritual discipline or activities you find helpful for your marriage? What spiritual discipline or activities you find helpful for your marriage? Maybe I'll start with the Hammonds.
Oh, right.
There's quite a few things. Obviously, the most obvious ones is that we attend church every Sunday as a couple, and we think that we've done that all through our married life, and I think that's presented a good example to our children that was a real strong priority for us. And that, after the service, then we'd discuss the service and things like that. So that was something that was no option. We would attend church. Things like around meal tables and things like that, as the children were growing up, we felt that was really important that we had set that time always as a family, and in that sort of environment, we'd bring up Christian subjects. There'd be no television, obviously in those days, no mobile phones, and that was a priority. Then for us, as a couple, like even today, we pray together every morning. We read the scripture every morning. Those sorts of disciplines, I think, have really helped us in our spiritual life together as husband and wife. Oh,
that's great. Thanks for that, Carolyn. What about Uncle TC, Auntie Mary? Anything from you?
Yeah, I agree. To add on to what they have shared, I think one thing is that getting involved with in terms of ministry together, to let our children see that we get involved. And then, and as they are growing, started with Sunday school, we get involved with Sunday school, and then, went on to youth, and then went on to even steps ministry. So yeah, so it's good to be involved so that they can see, and hopefully they will also join in. I think that was really helpful.
That's good.
Yeah, we would agree. I think something that's a bit novel for me at this time is having retired. Ruth and I do a lot more serving together, and which is touching on what Mary was saying. And it's great being able to welcoming together, doing morning tea together, washing up the dishes at the end of morning tea. You know, but it's really helpful. And for those of you who may not have really set a pattern for this, let me say to you that one of our joys usually on a Monday morning, sorry, let me start again. We have two married sons. One lives locally, 3-4 kilometres away. The other one lives in a place, what's it called? Geelong. Right. So that's all. We talk a bit personally because we moved back into the Illawarra and the son moved down to Geelong when we after a short time. So I don't think he was trying to move away from me. But anyway, truly, because he's removed, every Monday we meet on Zoom and pray together. So we spend about 20-30 minutes just catching up on stories, what's been happening in the family and so forth, and then we pray together. And that's something that is I would strongly encourage. We also schedule separate meetings with the grandchildren down in Geelong so that we can talk with them. And I think I think it's important as parents and grandparents to get to the stage where you recognise that your children, your grandchildren are maturing to the point that they need to make their own decisions. So the way that you have your discussions, the nature of the conversations you have over a meal or at the end of a meal, you need to recognise that some of their needs will be different. And I just share one story. My grandson, who will be 14 in November, he has rung me and said, "You got time to talk?" And so on Zoom, we interact. One of the Psalms, I don't know how well you know it. Those of you know who Sonny Phillip may have heard Sonny Phillip talk about this particular Psalm. But one of the Psalms talks about rejoicing at the enemy being destroyed. Their babies have been thrown onto their rocks and their innards have come out. My grandson said to me, he said, "How can we rejoice when that happens to mothers and to children?" Now, I won't go into the detail of the conversation, but it was great to be able to be asked the question. And then I was humbled. He said, "I think I'll go and check with Dad." And his father is an ordained Anglican minister, you know. So yeah. And then the other day he rang again. He said, "Oh, I've got another question for you," and I was amazed by the wording that he used. His question was framed something like this. He said, "What happens to those people who do not have the intellectual capacity to make a decision for Christ?" Now, this is someone who's not yet 14 years of age.
Boy.
Now, friends, the point of this is not my interaction with my grandson, but if you spend time with your children and you set a pattern for them to set with their children, your grandchildren, you'll be amazed how faithful God is in bringing forth a rich heritage, a Christian heritage in your family.
That's good. Thanks for that, Rob. Uncle TC, it seems like you wanted to add something just now.
So the add is, I think to be hospitable is good to invite friends to your home, and then your children will see that, and in turn they will be emulating that as well. Yeah.
Yeah. I think serving together, I think that's something that helps a lot, because it gives you guys, it gives couples also more things to talk about, to communicate, and that's actually, it's a joy to be able to do things together and to serve God together. That's fantastic. What about this question? Do you have any particular strategy to make date night or date time meaningful or effective? Do you have any particular strategy to make date time or date night meaningful or effective? I'll just throw it to any of you.
First, you have to make time.
Yes.
It has to be a deliberate thing.
Yeah,
to
looking
get
back
together
into, you know,
make a date.
what happened in our lives. We were so busy, and it's just so easy to not make it priority. You know, it's probably one of the things, never mind, next week. And it will always be next week. So the whole point is that we must make time So yeah, making time is one thing. So what else?
To help you with the future, when you have retirement, it's often not a problem.
Getting there.
Anything from you, Barry or Caroline?
I don't know. Well, when our children were young, we hardly had any date. We didn't do date. We didn't have any babysitters close by, so
yeah.
So I'm not very good at answering that question.
Yeah, one thing I must say.
Somebody younger might.
Sorry.
No, it's all yours, Mary.
No, I just suddenly thought about it. You know, we were talking about quality time, right? So, you know, when we were younger, obviously, you know, money is the issue, time is the issue. But one thing I say, you know, was the fact that if we can help each other in finishing the chores, even just to sit in front of the TV or just having a cup of coffee in the hand and make it special, in itself is good. You know, it's good enough. It's like a dead time, yeah. So right. Yeah, but of course, all the milestones is something that, you know, we keep.
Yes. Yeah, look, I concur with that. I think, look, as Karen said, we didn't go out much at night and or special dates or anything like that, but we spent a lot of time communicating. I think that's so very important that, you know, after a meal time or something like that, we might sit at the table for an hour and a half sometimes, just chatting about things and chatting about the day and all sorts of subjects. So they were very special times.
Yeah, well, that could very well be your date night, you know. So there you go. Yeah.
I remember that Ruth. I would come home from work, and she would ask me, "What did you have for lunch?" What did I have for lunch? Really? Yes. And that question in itself reminded me that I needed to give her time at the end of the day. And so if I've had a hard day at work, it's not about bringing my problems home and sitting in the corner and sitting there and just leave me alone, but it was a way of initiating communication. And so a very simple question like, what did you have for lunch? And the background is the place that I worked at the time, it had a canteen that was available to staff members. And so I just encourage the husbands first, that when you do come home, don't shut yourself off from your partner, from your wife, and be willing to start a conversation even over something like, what did you have for lunch? Because it's very important. We do get caught up in our work, and we can lock ourselves away in such a way that we're actually robbing meaningful interaction from our wives and children.
Especially when the children are little and you've been with them at home all day and you want them in bed and want to have some time together. I would like particularly some time with you, because I could be frazzled, frustrated, but try not to be.
That's very true. That's good. Thanks for that. And I think for me, I find particularly also helpful to plan. Sometimes it's good as well, so that both of us are actually looking forward to it, and also plan one or two icebreaking questions. There are so many good questions out there that you can steal from the internet and just ask some interesting question that can actually bring your conversation to a direction where you might be surprised. From time to time, I just ask, you know, how can I love you more? You know, that kind of question that can be interesting. But of course, you ask that question when you're in good terms. If you're not in good terms, then you'll be in trouble. But anyway, that's another one. Let's move to the next question. This is interesting. I feel that our lives sometimes revolve around our children, and any quality time involves them. How can we change that so that we put our relationship first? I feel our lives sometimes revolve around our children, and any quality time involves them. How can we change that so that we put our relationship first? For us, I guess it depends on the stage of the age of your children. We know that when they were very young, especially our first child, we found it very difficult to find time because it's all around the first child. We didn't know how to put them to bed, and we didn't know how to manage their nap time, playtime, and all these things. But then we discovered that we could actually train our children when they go to bed and things like that, and that actually helps a lot, so that we can plan our days better, and training our kids when to sleep, and so that they have a good routine, and that will impact our routine as well, so that we will have quality time without the children, even when they were younger age. I think that helps a lot. That will be one thing that I might want to share, but I don't know, anyone else would like to add to anything to that?
I would like to ask TC to comment on that.
Okay. I think when the children are very young, and we don't let the children stop us from doing, doing our ministry or quality time. For example, yeah. And I remember we were both serving in OCS in the troop, and they have camps and whatnot. And when they're very young, we just take them to the camp, you know, and then through time they get used to it. Sometimes it's hard because of the sleeping pattern and all this. So we normally one of us will put the kids to bed, and then the other person will be doing what I call ministry. And so don't let no kids hamper what you want to do. Just bring them out, visiting people and so on. Yeah.
I know with our children, with their family, like say with Sarah and Richard, they every so often will make a special night out. Might go to a movie, or might go to a play, or just go out for a lovely restaurant or something like that for an evening, and they'd call upon us to look after the children that night. So they do that on a fairly regular basis, which is a practice that we didn't do, but I think it's works really well for Richard and Sarah, and no doubt other families as well.
That's good. Anything from you, Rob or Ruth?
I'm looking at my wife. I think what has been said is probably our situation as well. Just going back to the question of date nights, we didn't have a lot of money when we got married, so we certainly couldn't afford to go out and do a lot. But we did organise, because we had parents and we had that we were close to. We developed relationships with people that we trusted to look after our two boys. And there were times that we would have a date night, and meant simply that the boys would go somewhere else. Yeah. Or and we would just have a bit of time to ourselves to do whatever we wanted to do. Sometimes it's just as simple as letting your partner sleep in longer than they normally do. It's little things like that. Our boys learned that they could sleep anywhere. They could be, if we were going out to visit a couple, then our kids would come along, and they learned to sleep on the floor, in a chair, on a couch, whatever was available. Yes, there might have been a lot of noise. Maybe there wasn't. Maybe there was a light on in the room. Maybe there wasn't. They learned at a very young age to make adjustments for how things were undertaken. And I just say thanks to God that some people have said to me, what did you guys do to get your boys to be where they are and doing the things they are, and you're seeing it with your children, your grandchildren, and say, well, basically it's God's grace. We do the best we can. We do what we think is best, and we learn from other couples.
That's good. And I want to encourage all of us to also, I guess, help one another. If you are in life group, for example, if you're in life group with other young parents, maybe offer to one another, why don't I look after your kids one night and you look after my kids one night, and that way your kids can play with their kids, and at the same time you can actually have your time, a special date night with your spouse. I think do that, help one another, serve one another in that way. That can be a good way to encourage each other in their in your marriage as well. So I guess that will be something. I'll move to the next question. I'm trying to paraphrase this a little bit because I'm not sure if I understand the question. I'm so sorry if you are asking this question. What ideas would you have to give quality time activity to your wife if it is not, if that is not your own love language? What ideas do you have to give quality time activity for your wife if it is not your own love language? I hope I don't misinterpret the question, but yeah.
I guess that's what Rob was talking about before, is self-sacrificing, like the husband. Quality time might not be his love language, but he knows it's his wife's, and you just do it, and then perhaps, you know, perhaps whatever yours is, she, you know, next time you can do what you like to do, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think it's just a case of, if you care about your wife, you'll want to please her and cherish her like that.
That's very true. That's very true.
It's good.
I would say, if you haven't read Gary Chapman's book, 5 Love
Yeah, I was
Languages,
about to say that.
I would strongly recommend you do that, because even though we'd been married for some years and I thought traveling okay, it helped me to understand a lot of things that what I like to do. So I know a little bit more about my own love languages, but also secondly, what's important to Ruth. So that was the first recommendation that I'd make. And certainly in the marriage preparation classes that we have run, we've always encouraged people to take a look at that. The other thing is, when it comes to the matter of what specific activities, I think there are activities in Chapman's book that will give you some ideas, but there's nothing better than just talking to your partner. You know, again, seek to understand what matters to her. I thought that she would love flowers, right? But it wasn't her love language. I learned that pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And I saved money. she wanted me to spend more time with her. Well, I was happy to do that. No, seriously, but you do experiment, and I mean, now some of you weren't online at the time, but Ruth and I have been married over 51 years now. We kind of got a good idea what is important, what are the quality time activities that are important to Ruth.
Yeah, and I would also encourage you to read the book, but seeking to understand rather than seeking to be understood, because it's easy when you read the book and you realize that, see, that's what I've been telling you, you told me, and you don't understand, and you don't want to create that, but rather try to understand your spouse rather than the other way around. And I hope that your spouse will read the same book, trying to understand you, and that will. What
comes to my mind, Sandy, is that Carolyn's into dancing in the big way, tap dancing. Wow. And I'm not really into dancing, but I'd go to the concerts there, and I'd be very excited when I saw Carolyn and the rest of the ladies on stage dancing. But to sit through a whole dancing concert, and I would see these little girls of 3 and 4, and they just stood there, and people were applauding, and I'm pretty much bored to tears, to be honest. But it was good to be able to go there and encourage Carolyn, because I know she really loves that. Conversely, we've got an old vintage car with V53, and we won't go for a drive down to Williamstown now. I really love driving this old car, but I'm sure Carolyn would much prefer to be in the luxury of the Lexus with air conditioning, all the rest of it. But she puts up with it and probably wishes she was in the other car, and you make those sort of sacrifices because that's what they're interested. Each partner's interested.
That's good. That's great to hear. Yeah. Well, the secret is now out, so I would love to see Carolyn doing tap dancing.
I've retired. Sorry, I've retired.
Very good.
All right, cool. And there are 2 more questions. I'll start with this one. maybe this is directed to Rob. Again, this is more theological question. Exclusivity and permanence, does this apply only to life on earth? Or does this extend to when we are in heaven? Will my wife still be my wife in heaven?
Well, before I give my answer, what do the rest of you think? Yes or no?
I thought it's till death do us part.
Oh, no.
So
That's correct.
no point.
Yeah. No, Jesus made it quite clear that when we get to heaven, there is no marriage
relationship.
in heaven.
Mm.
Right, so we will still have our life partners. Let me ask you now a question, and this is, I guess, more rhetorical because I can't get 30 odd people, some 30 people answering. But have you ever asked the question, why isn't there marriage in heaven? The answer to that question is there is no marriage in heaven, because marriage is the symbol of the relationship between Christ and the church. And the reality of that relationship between Christ and the church will be fulfilled at that time. So when you have the reality, you no longer need the symbol. So remember, in the Old Testament, there had to be a sacrificial system. We don't have it now, because the sacrificial system that is most pleasing to God is the one from Christ. There used to be a temple, but there's no temple anymore, because we, the church, are the temple of the living God. Why won't there be marriage? Because marriage is a picture, it's a symbol. It represents the relationship between Christ and the church. And so when we get to heaven, there is no need for marriage anymore.
That's a really good question. That's a really good answer. Thanks, Rob. We'll end with this one last question. And I just throw it to anyone who would like to answer this. What should I do when I don't have any or very little desire to be physically intimate with my spouse? What should I do when I don't have any or very little desire to be physically intimate with my spouse?
I'd maybe suggest going to see your GP just to make sure there's no physical reason why you feel that way, just to eliminate that. And maybe look at ways of being intimate in other ways, like just sitting and talking and not putting pressure on yourself, but simple things like holding a hand, just start off small and maybe, but yeah, I think the GP might be the good port of call.
Yep, it is. It's good. That's good suggestion. Anyone else would like to add to that?
Our situation was that Ruth went to a GP to check out, and she had a physical condition which would cause a great deal of pain during the act of intimacy. Right? And so you have to make a decision about what you're going to do. As a husband, am I going to insist on my rights? Or am I going to be understanding of the needs of my wife and choose to self-sacrifice? And so, as Carolyn said, you go to the doctor first to make sure that you understand whether there is a physical condition or not, and seek to have that treated. Ruth's treatment didn't help, and so we chose not to engage in sexual intercourse. But we found ways that were still meaningful for us to enjoy a relationship as husband and wife, times of intimacy.
It's good. Thanks for that. Thanks for sharing, Rob.
That's been fairly transparent. I did check with Ruth first if it was okay to mention that, and she said, no, it's okay to share that.
It's good. Thanks for that. Yeah. I guess also if I could add, once we eliminate those physical reasons, I think another reason that might be that you can think about is I feel that physical intimacy is the consummation of your complete of your whole intimacy. So which means that your emotional intimacy, I feel that must come first. sometimes maybe you don't feel like being physically intimate because you're not emotionally connected to your spouse. And that can be a reason. And that can be a reason as well. So therefore, I think loving one another and sacrificial love towards one another helps. I read somewhere that it says that physical intimacy starts from the kitchen. It means that when you help with the dishes, when you help with the chores, that actually creates that emotional connection, emotional intimacy, and that actually will increase the desire for physical intimacy as well. So don't forget that aspect as well. Don't just think about physical intimacy, but that emotional connection is very important. When God says to become one, it's not, I don't think it's just for physical intimacy, but I think the whole thing, spiritual intimacy, emotional connection, and all those stuff as well. Yeah.
Agreed.
Cool. I think we will end there. Thank you so much, everyone, for thank you so much, Rob and Ruth. Thank you so much, Aunt Carolyn.
Yeah, thank you, Rob and Ruth.
And TC and Mary for joining us, for answering the questions, for sharing your experience. We have learned a lot from all of you. And yeah, thanks so much for that.